Hey everybody, Star 6 Wars 1 here, and welcome to the next months of Gynax video. For this one, we are taking a look at the sequel to Gunbuster, Diebuster, or Gunbuster 2. Now, I'm going to flat out say this right now. Yes, there will be one or two comparisons to Gunbuster. No, I'll try and limit them to only a few. So without further ado, let's begin with the story. Now, the story of Diebuster takes place a little before the last few minutes of Gunbuster, 12,000 years in the future. Oh yeah, spoiler for Gunbuster. Though that's pretty much way out of context and you won't get any of it without watching Diebuster and Gunbuster. So, spoiler, but it makes no sense. It takes place 12,000 years after Gunbuster's final episode, and just before the last few minutes of the final episode. So it's a midquel. Our story begins with Nano as she is journeying to become a space pilot, but unfortunately does not have the skill to do so. And then she meets a space cadet by the name of Lalak. I think that's her name. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And she calls her Omi-sama, Big Sister, and continues to follow her around, becomes a space pilot, and discovers things about herself she never didn't know previously. And before you ask, I'm not giving any more away of the story because, oh boy, does it get more interesting from there. If that didn't interest you, I don't think anything will. One thing I want to note, though, two things I want to note, though, and it's my first comparison to Gunbuster. Diebuster is definitely more over the top than Gunbuster. There's a lot more ludicrous moments and things that should be impossible. Whereas Gunbuster was very realistic, Diebuster is not for the most part. And yes, it's a little more silly, but it has its solemn moments and can be solemn when needed. Look up the final episode. Which brings me to my next point. I'm not going to spoil anything what happens, but like Gunbuster, Diebuster ends on a bittersweet note. Unlike Gunbuster, however, the feeling is much more bitter than it is sweet. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something I want you to make a note of. Diebuster is more bittersweet, bitter than it is sweet, and whereas Gunbuster was more sweet in its ending than it was bitter. But both were bittersweet endings, but maybe that's for another time. Next up, how's the characters? They're good, I guess, but the problem is, and once again, comparison time, they're not as good as Gunbuster. Unfortunately, the problem with the characters comes straight down to the nitty-gritty of the side characters. I can remember at least 3 of the characters, if not more, from Gunbuster, and liked them, for better or for worse. There were times they annoy me, but still. Diebuster has a little less of a likable cast at times, and some of them come off as just more of assholes than anything else. Except the main character, Nano, who is honestly my favorite character in the Gunbusters franchise now. I like her. I like her a lot. Now, what about this Lalak? I like her but not as much as any of the Gunbusters one, which had a similar character, but I think she was done better in Gunbuster. Again, but I'm going to stop comparing. The characters are still good, just I think they are a bit of a step backwards. What's a step forwards, however, is the animation and the music. The animation is definitely a step up. Then again, it was only made about 11 years ago, whereas Gunbuster was made 26. Can you believe that? So Diebuster obviously is going to have better animation. And I think that also it had better music, at least overall. Whereas I'm not as fond of the opening of Diebuster as I am of Gunbuster. I think the ending theme and the rest of the OST of Diebuster is at least better. Not on par with some of my favorite OSTs, but still a good one. Now, I've talked those praises things to death, haven't I? There's only one... I've talked about the story, including the end bit of the ending. Well, I have not given it straight out away. I've talked about everything else. What is there left to talk about? The fan service. Unfortunately, the fan service once again rears its ugly head. It's not quite as bad as Gunbuster. Gunbuster had a lot of nudity towards beyond episode 2, but Diebuster had a little less, but not by much. So, and yes, it still has nudity. So if that's a turnoff for you guys, then I am sorry. But that is how it is. Overall, and yes, I'm going to say this, Diebuster is as good, in my opinion, as Gunbuster, but for different reasons. I definitely think that Diebuster is definitely the more over-the-top anime, but whereas Gunbuster feels a little more realistic and a bit, at times, more solemn, though both could do solemn really well when they needed to. But I also think that Diebuster had better animation and better music, and a better main character. Again, my opinion. Also my character tastes. Overall, I definitely say give both a watch, and I definitely say give Diebuster a watch, but I'd watch Gunbuster first to get some of the context. You don't need to necessarily, but I recommend watching Gunbuster first, then Diebuster. I give Diebuster a 7.5 out of 10. It has the exact same score as Gunbuster because I think it's just as good. And like Gunbuster, I think this screams of genuine effort and love, which is really nice. Anyways, that's all from me. This has been Star 6 Wars 1, and I'll see you guys next time.